Wednesday night with the stroke of a pen, President Donald Trump ending the government shutdown after that record-setting 43 days of shutdown. That doesn't mean things automatically start rolling right away, but it certainly is a start. That's where we begin this week on Connect to the Capitol. We welcome you in. And Dave Wilson is up in that other Capitol. Washington,
Still
D.C.
here up in D.C.
Yeah,
the wind blowing a little bit this morning. So, but it's been interesting, Brian, because we have seen so many impacts of this shutdown in so many different directions. The person who would normally be here still stuck in travel traffic. Catherine Glenn Foster is still stuck overseas right now because of things like slowdowns in air traffic. The government, the FAA, has turned around and said we're going to reduce the number of flights going in and out of certain airports. That's impacted. We talked about that last week. But, Brian, there's still a whole lot more that's going on.
There is. And here in South Carolina, of course, we're going to see that those flights are still going to probably be impacted because we have so many major hubs that do fly here and in and out of here. So a couple more weeks, I think. They're still at 6% reductions nationwide as this slowly gets phased back in. The big thing here in South Carolina, Dave, if you remember, that we talked extensively about for the past couple of weeks is SNAP benefits, food assistance programs. People had a burden placed on them in this state. Food banks were already stretched thin. The money has started flowing. The state DSS officials putting out the guidance on Thursday that folks were going to get their money by Monday, not by Monday, by Friday. So that's one thing that did get going almost immediately.
Well, that was a big contentious issue up here in Washington between the Senate over here and the House right behind me. There was this question about how we were going to handle SNAP benefits. What is going to be done for the 42 million Americans, nearly 500,000 of those living in South Carolina, who were getting subsistence benefits to pay for food. Previous shutdowns have never included SNAP before. They've never included an essential issue like that. This particular one did. And to be honest, Brian, I think a lot of it was a tool and a ploy that was being used by both sides as a negotiation tool. And that's what we saw a lot of things happening here in Washington. Catherine and I were doing preparation for the show before transit issues made it difficult for her to be able to join us this Sunday morning. But what we saw and what we talked about was the fact that when you look at the level of debate, the issues that are on the table, and we're going to have a whole discussion about those during the show this morning, there are more and more places where Republicans and Democrats were encamping themselves until finally we got to that breaking point on Wednesday, and we saw everything begin to move. Members of Congress got back miraculously through the air back here to Washington, D.C. for the House to take that final vote on Wednesday, because that was the moment that they decided we're going to take healthcare issues off the table for now. We're going to make sure that SNAP gets put back in here. We're going to try everything we can to get federal workers back, because keep in mind, 1.25 million federal workers either were furloughed or went to work without pay for 43 days. That's at least 3, if not 4 paychecks for folks. And that can be a very difficult thing. Think about this at home, folks. Imagine going without a paycheck for a month and a half.
Now, this temporary funding plan has some safeguards in place to at least keep SNAP rolling if we had another government shutdown anytime in the future. But here, even locally in the state of South Carolina, we have lawmakers at the State House that are saying we need a safety net in place as well here at the state level. You and I talked about that the other day, that probably in January they're going to talk about things like this, that, hey, if the Feds shut down again, we got to make sure our people are fed.
Well, let's talk about one gubernatorial candidate who actually has said he's going to bring that up, and that's Representative Jermaine Johnson, the Democrat out of Hopkins, turned around and said just the other week, listen, we're going to make this an issue of the campaign. We're going to make sure that we're going to put this SNAP benefit backup plan in place in South Carolina so that doesn't happen again. I mean, think about this. There's 5.5 million people in South Carolina. That means that 1 in 9 people in our state were not receiving food benefits that they're used to having. Now, there are plenty of people on the Republican side who will turn around and say, well, we don't need to be having these programs. And yet at the same time, we have had these programs. People are relying upon these programs. And that's where the big issue is coming down between Republicans and Democrats about what the government should and should not be funding, what is and is not in place, what will and will not continue.
Yeah, that's going to be there are so many things that we talked about in this governor's race, but this one has really come front and center. And I think we're going to see both sides of the aisle probably go at this one pretty hard.
Probably so, because this is something that really ties into almost every single district of every legislator in South Carolina. There's not one that really is exempt from this, because areas of poverty are somewhat concentrated in our state. If you take a look at the top counties where we have the highest number of benefits, Richland County, Greenville County, Charleston County, some there along the I-95 corridor are also high. So this is where you have high impacts of this on larger populations that are concentrated together. And so between that and the issue of being able to have access through food deserts and everything else, that's really playing itself out as to how do we start dealing with the issue of making sure that the funds that are supposed to be coming from the federal government are flowing themselves down and providing the needed support that are needed in communities across the state of South Carolina.
All right, Dave, we're going to get to this in the next segment, but the big holdup in all of this was, of course, those health care subsidies that Democrats and Republicans are really going to war over and in this shutdown, and really was the sticking point here. We're going to talk about possible solutions to that, because that debate's going to pick up next month, according to Senator Lindsey Graham and also Congressman Jim Clyburn, who wants to see some action taken on that so people's health care premiums just don't go sky high. We're going to talk about that when we come back on Connect to the Capitol, and we're going to get some people in there to keep that wind away from Dave's hair.
I'm no longer going to continue to take taxpayer dollars and give it to insurance companies to get an inferior outcome. There's a better way. I'm going to take the same amount of money and flow it to people directly so they can have purchasing power they don't have today. You can't buy a house with it. You can't buy a car. It's going to be used to purchase health care, and it will create competition.
Lindsey Graham in Columbia the other day talking about this continuing debate over health care premiums, subsidies that help prop up the insurance marketplaces for folks trying to get low-cost access to health care. He calls the current setup a gravy train for the insurance companies. Dave Wilson, this is a debate that really was the sticking point in this government shutdown. That part of it isn't over. It wasn't addressed in the deal that was signed off on the other day. And Graham says, look, we got to get rid of these subsidies for these insurance giants who are getting rich while the people aren't getting anything in return. He wants to give the money to them. And like you said before the show even started, we need competition in this space.
That's exactly the point here, Brian, because that is exactly what the Senate was dealing with when the debate was going on. Everything really boiled down to two things: SNAP, which we talked about in the last segment, and what are we going to do about continuing subsidies for health insurance that started all the way back in COVID. Remember, in COVID, there was a time period where we got the stimulus checks that came in, but they also passed a bill that said we're going to temporarily put more subsidy money into health insurance to keep health insurance costs low. And some of you at home felt that happen because your health insurance costs all of a sudden went down. But that was a 5-year plan. Guess what happened? The 5-year plan has now ended, and that's what caused the extension of this 43-day government shutdown from what had been expected to be maybe 1-2 weeks all the way out to 43 days. That's more than 7 weeks of the government not in operation. So what does that mean? Well, to Lindsey Graham's point here, Brian, we have to remember government subsidies under the Affordable Health Care Act kept insurance costs low for people who were what's called the exchange. And so in those, there's an insurance premium that you pay, and then there's what the government subsidy did on top of that. Because this is your total insurance cost, the government covered about that much. So what they did was the government covered about a little bit more of that and kept the cost low for people. Now that that money is now no longer part of the debate, we're all going to be taking a look at our insurance, especially when we get back to this time period we're in right now, when you're doing renewal of your health insurance plan for the next year. For many of you who've already taken a look at that, you're looking at premiums that are going to be up 20, 30, 40%. Some people have said it's at least 100% for them. That's the sticking point, and that's where congressional leaders on the House and Senate side both said, listen, let's take this off the table. Let's get the government funded. We will come back to and address the issue that has to do with government subsidies for health insurance. But remember that amount that the government sends, they don't send it to you. That's money going directly to the insurance companies. And that's where a lot of Republicans have turned around and said, see, we told you the Affordable Care Act was not going to turn around and be the benefit for people as we said it was going to be, because insurance costs are going to rise. Government subsidies are only going to be able to pay so much. And that gap in between is now starting to get larger. And we're beginning to feel that when we look at our health insurance premiums for the coming year.
Yeah. And we've talked to a lot of those providers here locally who are just saying people are making hard decisions right now with their money when it comes to that health care. This issue certainly not settled. You said there are some other ones too that maybe on the surface look like they're solved right now with the shutdown being over, but they aren't. There's a timeline on those.
Well, part of the agreement, Brian, that happened over there in the Senate the other night when the senators were meeting and they were trying to decide, one of the things that brought those 7 senators and that one independent, the 7 Democrats and the 1 independent over, that actually made it possible for them to have closure or ending of debate on this bill to actually bring it to a vote, was the statement about we're not going to put SNAP back into any sort of continuing resolution again. We've got to make sure that that remains funded. But they also said we're going to put off the issue on health care. But there is a time frame on this. This current continuing resolution lasts until January the 30th. That means we're going to have to be at this again. So what the Congress is doing right now is saying, okay, well, we'll pay these month's bills, and then we'll take care of these month's bills. And it's like living paycheck to paycheck almost. And that's really what the federal government is doing right now. But there's no budget in place. It's just, we've got the money. We need to figure out where we're going to spend it, and we're going to do it that way and not really set a budget like we have to do in South Carolina every single year. There is a budget committee. They do have budgets, but the appropriation of those dollars and how those dollars get spent is really being done on a really short time frame, time and time again. One of the things that was left off are things that are going to be coming up in September. They're going to be aging out and going to go back into the discussion in September, just weeks before the midterm elections. Democrats are saying, listen, we'll allow these things to be part of things that are off the table right now, but be guaranteed they're going to be back on the table when we get to a continuing resolution time period, most likely in the end of September, just weeks before midterm elections, which the Democrats are hoping is going to be a heyday for them and a real hit to Donald Trump and the Republicans.
So you're saying there's some strategy to this, Dave. There's a game plan.
There's a little bit of a game plan going on. You know, you take a look at these 2 houses of Congress. You've got the House over here, the Senate over here, and down the street, just a little bit further, is the White House. All of these pieces are moving right now, and there's so much that's going on behind the scenes as to how we're going to play this out. What's the timing of doing something? How does this end up impacting what's going to happen in the election? Because keep in mind, the gap between the Republicans and the Democrats in the U.S. House right now is razor thin. There is no really solid, serious majority. It's only a handful of difference between the 2 parties on the number of members that they have. So any sway one way or the other can change the balance of power between Republicans and Democrats, especially in the House of Representatives.
Well, that's another wait and see, but I think we know what we're waiting to see right there. A full-on battle before we get to the midterms. Speaking of battle, that's coming up in the next segment, but I don't really know who's fighting here. Last week we talked about Congresswoman Nancy Mace and her incident at the Charleston airport. She doubled down this week. We're going to get into that briefly, and also pay for lawmakers in this state. That's when we come back on Connect to the Capitol.
The cop or cops that filed a false incident report. You're giving other cops a bad name, and I'm coming for you. I absolutely 100% confronted the airport employees who put my safety at risk. Did I drop an F-bomb? I hope I did. Did I call them incompetent? If I didn't, they absolutely earned it.
All right, Nancy Mace, that was what she said about a week ago after an incident with TSA and security at the Charleston International Airport. She doubled down this week and says people are watching her. She's under surveillance, and she doesn't feel fully safe. Dave, we talked a lot about this last week. I don't know where this debate is even going at this point, but we've certainly had other members of the delegation from South Carolina saying they've had nothing but positive experiences at that particular airport and everywhere they go.
That's the point, Brian, is you look at the fact that members of Congress, dignitaries, certain folks get special escort capability when they go to airports across the country. That's one of the privileges that they have. It allows them to bypass the security gates, go straight through, and get to their jets and travel faster. Nancy Mace is upset right now because she said she was going to be at the airport at a certain time at a certain door. She ended up being there later in a different car than what police understood she was going to be at the TSA. So they were not at the door to greet her and escort her. She ended up at TSA. The TSA agents end up showing up there. She then starts this altercation, verbal altercation with them. And did she drop some F-bombs? They say she sure did. So this is Nancy Mace continuing the debate. But unfortunately, as much as she has turned around and said, listen, they didn't do anything to protect me. They're surveilling me. Guess what, folks? We're all being surveilled when we turn around and we go into an airport that has security cameras everywhere. Are they looking for her specifically? I don't think they're looking for her specifically, except to find out where she is when she says she's going to be somewhere. This is just part of a continuing effort, it seems like, on Mace's part to remain some level of relevant in a political conversation. She makes videos out of it that honestly sound more like they should come out of the Avengers series than anything else. The music that goes behind it, if you got a comment that you want to make about something, then make the comment. You don't have to do a whole trailer about this. And that is a very interesting way that she is continuing to keep herself in the mainstream. But going against law enforcement in this particular case and saying they deserve to have F-bombs dropped on them because they were incompetent, well, some other members of Congress said that's not going to be the case at all. Now, on the flip side, she's now facing some other legal issues because her former fiance, who she claimed in her debate or in her speech right here in the U.S. House back in February, has now turned around and filed claims against her for the things that she did in finding the videos and saying that there are things that are out there. And it's a defamation suit that will be very interesting to see how that plays itself out over the next several weeks and months as this continues in the court system, and she's running for governor at the same time.
Yeah, this I think I'm on the same page with you when it comes to this as we continue this race. Quickly before we end this segment, talk about that raise that state lawmakers gave themselves. They're not going to get it. The Supreme Court this week saying nope, no dice. We can wrap
the
up
Supreme Court. Yeah, Brian, the Supreme Court was very clear on this one. And they really ticked off a lot of people in the South Carolina legislature. So let's break this down real quick. Legislators in South Carolina have not received any pay raise for more than 20 to 25 years. Their pay is $10,500 a year. They get that in a lump sum at the beginning of the year. If they have health care with the state, it's taken out of that first. They may end up with $5,000 to $6,000 for serving in the South Carolina legislature every year. Several years ago, they put in $1,000 a month stipend to be used for in-district expenses. So that basically, could it be considered a pay raise? Could it not be considered a pay raise? Up until just this past year, it had been considered part of the normal pay that they would receive for expenses that they had during the off season of the legislature. Keep in mind, that's all the way from the middle of May until January when they return. With that, though, that pay, which is taxable pay, is now no longer on the table. During the last debate, Senator Shane Martin out of Spartanburg County had put a proviso into the budget that increased that $1,000 to $2,500. That triggered a whole huge backlash because nothing was done about a debate on this issue. It wasn't a bill that was passed. It was simply a proviso that was stuck into the budget on the Senate side, and then it ended up passing in both chambers. That would have increased their pay by almost $18,000. But because of the way that it was done and the way that it's phrased in there, Senator Wes Clymer out of York County, who is now running for Ralph Norman's seat in the 5th Congressional District, turned around and filed suit with his old buddy Dick Harpootlian, former state senator from here in Columbia, and said, we're going to go after this because we don't think it's constitutional. The case was heard. The Supreme Court came down this past week and said, you're right, you can't do it. As a matter of fact, you can't even have the $1,000 that you're used to having. And that has really ticked off a lot of members of the South Carolina legislature. And some of them are turning around and saying, well, what we're doing now is basically creating an aristocracy, because it's nearly impossible for the average person in South Carolina to take the weeks and weeks of time that it takes to be a legislator in this state. Because keep in mind, they're at the State House for 18 weeks out of the year, plus other meetings that happen during the off season, and be able to have any level of pay more than $10,500 in a given year. Expect to see them come back, make changes in that, so that the pay in some way or another is going to be able to be increased, so that you can have people who can afford to be away from work, away from home, to serve in the legislature in South Carolina. But the big sticking point came from what the Supreme Court said. Any pay increase, any increase whatsoever, is going to have to go into effect after the next election.
On Friday, the state of South Carolina carrying out its third execution by firing squad. Stephen Bryant, convicted of a killing spree back in 2004. 3 people killed over a several-day period here in the Midlands. One of the victims was shot, his eyes burned with cigarettes, and Bryant writing on the wall in the victim's blood. Here in South Carolina, this could be the last death sentence carried out for at least several months as they worked their way through that backlog when things were put on pause for about a decade here along death row. Firing squad, Dave Wilson, that's 3 methods of execution now we have seen just in recent months. But what you're saying is there could be some movement at the State House come January to start changing how we dispense justice in this state.
There is a bill that's going to be coming out in January to eliminate the death penalty in South Carolina. Some groups have been calling for it for quite a while. We've had Reverend Hillary Taylor on the show several times talking about that, because they want to eliminate this, saying that it's cruel and unusual. Now, the Supreme Court has said that it's not, but the legislature is the one to decide, because remember, there are only 3 forms of execution that are available, and inmates have to choose which one they want to have. They can either have the firing squad, which is now happening for the 3rd time. There is lethal injection, and there's the electric chair. And all 3 have been used in the last decade since we've been having executions. Well, not since we've had executions going back on. They've only been through a lethal injection and with the firing squad. But that 3rd option is also available. They have to have at least 2 to choose from. And now that we have that in place, we've had a long spree of executions in South Carolina because there's been that backlog, Brian, now for 10 years, and that got reinstated just this past year.
So something to watch again come January, and we'll see that debate pick up here very, very soon. One final note before we get out of here. There are a couple runoff elections in the city of Columbia for some city council seats. Voter turnout extremely low for the first round of municipal elections a little over about 2 weeks ago. Dave, your final word on that. We got about 30 seconds. It's essentially a pep talk. If you want to see changes in your world, you got to vote.
Yeah, you've got to show up. If decisions are made by those who show up, only less than 4% of people showed up for the last election. There is a runoff right now for 2 different seats there on Columbia City Council. So get out to vote this Tuesday. The polls will be open 7 to 7. If you do not know where to vote, go to scvotes.org. It should be listed on there, or check your local election commission website. It will tell you, just like it is in Columbia. Some of those have been consolidated. Earlwood Park was one place where several different ones were consolidated. It's where I ended up voting instead of over in Elmwood Park. So take a look, find out where you're supposed to be, and show up to vote this Tuesday.
All right. It can't be any simpler than that. Dave Wilson, thanks again for joining us from the nation's capital. You've been a trooper fighting that wind It's good to see that business is picking up again.
It's a little bit hard on this
Yes, it
morning.
is,
So
but I see activity behind you in Washington, D.C. again, so this is a good thing.
yeah, the government is open back up, and hopefully Catherine Glenn Foster will be able to
hopefully
join
her
us
business
again
will be open
soon
back
and
up
get
by
through
next
all of
week,
these
too.
travel issues because of the issues
right.
of the federal government shutdown.
That's right. All right, thanks, folks, for joining us for Connect to the Capitol this week. We'll do it again next Sunday.